comparative essay. We'll call this tutorial part 1, and we'll get to the part 2 stuff a little bit later on. In this tutorial, we'll take a look at the importance of using this kind of approach in the first place. We'll take a look at your topics and your texts. We'll discuss the importance of creating a question, brainstorming, and secondary sources. We'll try to identify themes and categories for our choices, and then finally we'll take that question that we've created here and try to create a thesis from that. So really briefly, I think there are two things you want to keep in mind as to why we're using this approach. First of all, I think this approach that we'll model in a moment or two can be used for any sort of assignment or task. So this problem-solving sort of method, I think, just works really well. The second reason why we want to consider this is this approach will prepare you for the sort of assignments you tend to receive at the university level. Professors and instructors in the arts and the social sciences in universities tend to give general topics for essays and assignments, and it's up then to the student to conduct the research, create a thesis, and prove the thesis is true in the body of the essay. So I think this approach will prepare you for that sort of assignment down the road. So let's take a look at our first steps. Well, the students in my ENG 3U classes are currently working with these topics and these kinds of texts. But the approach we're going to outline now will work with any comparative essay regardless of your topics and your texts. So the students in my class need to choose some topic that has to do with media production and portrayal. So depiction of women or depiction of race or faith, for example. And they need to choose two texts. And we're using text in a postmodern sense here, meaning any text that has been deliberately created for a specific audience. And they have to combine these, and we'll talk about the combination of that in a moment. Now, when you choose your text, there are a few things you want to keep in mind. You can choose text from different mediums. So, for example, you can have a film and a TV show. But it's actually quite helpful to make sure that they are from the same genre. And by that I mean that they are the same kind of storytelling. So, for example, perhaps you are looking at a dystopian world that's in a video game. Well, you can certainly look at a film version of a dystopian world as well. Okay, so let's imagine you've chosen your topics, you've got two texts, and you want to know what to do with it next. Well, we need to create a question. If we can create a question from what we've got up to this point, then we could eventually get ourselves to a thesis. So let's imagine we've got the depiction of women as my topic. I've got my one text for this example will be Cinderella. And let's imagine that I've got Twilight as my other text. Well, simply by combining these three outside triangles, these three ideas, into a question, I'm well on my way to actually constructing a thesis. So I could turn this into a question, something like, how are women depicted in Cinderella and Twilight? Now at this stage, the question can be almost anything as long as it's relatively open-ended. We don't want a sort of question that will lead to a yes-no sort of response. We want something that requires you to develop a longer and sustained response if you hope to answer that question. So this is a question we'll work with. So let's take a quick look at brainstorming and secondary sources. Clearly at this stage we need to start collecting examples and evidence from the two texts that we've considered. So in this case, Twilight and Cinderella. And I want to keep that question that I created in the last step in mind as I do this. So I want to keep looking for examples of how women are depicted, how they're shown in these two stories. Now, I also want to look for sources, secondary sources, articles, and that sort of thing that connect to my question as well. So if I'm lucky, I might find an article that refers to the depiction of women, specifically Bella in Twilight. And if I find that, that's great. I can definitely use that as a secondary source. But I also might want to keep in mind that there are other sources that may refer to part of my question that might be useful. Just because I find, let's say if I don't find an article about Bella and her depiction as a woman in this story, I still might find an article that outlines the depiction of women generally in film, right? That might still be useful. Or perhaps I'd find an article about the depiction of women in female characters in Disney or in fairy tales. And those would still be relevant. And I need you to keep in mind that simply because the source doesn't specifically refer to your sources doesn't mean it won't be useful to you. Right? That's especially true as you think about that context of the topic that you're looking at. Well, once you've collected all your information, you've got all your brainstormed ideas from the two texts, and you found some stuff from secondary sources, you want to start trying to create categories that allow you to organize all this information you've collected. So let's imagine that I've done that. I've tried to organize my findings up until this point into categories. And my two categories that I've come up with here are damsels in distress and defined by male characters. And so in these examples, what this means is that the characters in Twilight and Cinderella, the female characters anyway, always seem to be relatively helpless in the face of danger of any kind. This category might suggest that these female characters are defined by the males around them, that their identity relies on males as opposed to who they really are, right? So by organizing my ideas into these two categories, I'm well on my way to answering this question, right? So if I can answer that question, how are women depicted in Cinderella and Twilight? If I can answer that question in a single sentence, what I will have is a workable thesis. Now, it may not be perfect, it might need some tweaking, but by going through this process, what I've done is I've collected all my information and I've narrowed my focus according to categories, and now I can use those categories, in this case the damsels in distress and being defined by male characters, as a way of creating a specific thesis statement that I know I can prove because I've already collected all the information that proves this statement is true. So there we go. By following these steps, what we've been able to do is move from some initial ideas about what we wanted to examine, a general topic with no clear guidelines, to a specific thesis statement that meets our criteria and gives us something really specific to prove. And if you follow this process, I think you'll have great success in your essays, because once you have a thesis that is specific and provable, all you need to do is dedicate the rest of time to proving this statement is true.